It's actually a smaller room than
My
I
problem is that
thought
I
it
don't
was.
have my water bottle when I'm at home, and so I
good
get
thing.
dehydrated on the
Yeah,
weekends.
no, I was expecting one thing.
Yeah.
Reserve in front rows.
Yeah, sorry.
That's cool. No worries.
You can sit in the second.
Being close enough to throw things.
You can sit in the second row. Hey, Steve.
Make for an exciting panel.
Okay, folks, I would like to congratulate you on being so punctual, especially given the rain and given the atrocious state of Washington Metro public transportation. We'll wait just 15 or 20 seconds and then get started. I think there's just a couple of other folks filtering in.
You're like me, I did that too.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about acquisition innovation and really executing on acquisition innovation. I'd like to start up by thanking our friends at the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental for offering to co-host with us today. This is going to be a fun conversation, and we're going to just jump straight in. Our purpose today is to talk about the practical methods by which we can improve our acquisition methods today or in the very near future. I know we use the word innovation in the title, which makes it seem like we're going to talk about arbitrary, fluffy topics. That is not what we're going to do. We're going to talk about practical matters. We're going to have a short panel right now that's going to sort of set some of the scene and some of those bigger picture what's happening. And then after that, we're going to do a short Q&A, followed by a lightning round of practical conversations from practitioners talking about how they are executing on innovation. So we'll try to keep this interactive, and we'll also try to keep it short and informative. I'm joined by a very helpfully diverse group of folks. We have Matthew Bloom from OMB, from the White House, who focuses on acquisition innovation. We have Lauren Schmidt from the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. I'm just going to say DIUX for the rest of this conversation, who really focuses on all of the acquisition innovation efforts from the DIUX. And we have Bill Greenwald, who focuses on acquisition policy and a number of other important things from the Senate Armed Services Committee. You may have seen some of their recent work in the news in the last 24 hours or so. So with that, I want to go through and start with sort of some of the big picture things and really focus on the problem that we're all trying to solve. I think we're going to think about that problem differently given our different vantage points. But Matthew, from your perspective, how do you just define the problem that you're trying to address in acquisition innovation?
Well, I'm going to borrow a quote that our former administrator, Anne Rung, adopted. I don't know if she coined it, probably not, but she always talked about, felt like her job was to fight the tyranny of complexity. And not hard for anybody that is familiar with acquisition to understand why she was using that phrase, and I think used it more frequently as she heard people come to her doorstep with recommendations for change and complaining about how our process is too slow, how people are discouraged from taking risk, how we have high failure rates for very large acquisitions, that we are forced to accept second-generation technology when we should be getting cutting-edge technology. And clearly, every administrator has embraced innovation. But what Anne did, which I thought was really wonderful on this, is that she saw a direct relationship between the ability to fight this complexity and the extent to which we create an environment that embraces innovation and creativity. And why I think she was spot on that is for two primary reasons. One is, while our rules are complex, I think everybody would agree that there's actually a lot of flexibility in these authorities that give people wiggle room. And who better to know the areas where to make improvement than our workforce that deals with this on an everyday basis. So if we have an environment that embraces them or encourages them to identify these problems and we have continual process improvement, I think that's a great step forward. And we can multiply that success if we also break down barriers simultaneously to bring industry in where they are not currently doing business with the government to help us think through these problems. And secondly, it is a very efficient way to promote continual process improvement. Right. So clearly some of the most significant authorities that we talk about we're talking about just basic simplification, not necessarily in R&D, but like the simplified acquisition threshold, weren't developed overnight. They were actually developed through years of discussion that started with, frankly, a very smart panel of people that were looking very deeply into DoD and other acquisition laws and regulations. And we're going through that process again now with 809. And over the course of time, there will be lots of dialogue that will result in recommendations that Congress will act on, that the administration will act on, and we will probably get some really good things coming out of that. But in the meantime, there's a lot that we can do ongoing basis to address the problems that are at hand. So in summary, I think three specific problems that we see needing to be addressed that innovation helps. One, it's going to help us to leverage the flexibilities and the authorities that we have. Two, it's going to empower our workforce to take advantage and to think of new and better ways of doing business. I should mention that on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, I think the vast majority of our employees, at least as of 2 years ago, felt like they weren't empowered or encouraged sufficiently to be innovative in their thinking. And third, that we have to really make it easier for agencies to contract with those sources that are not currently doing business with us. And when I say that, this is not meant to suggest that incumbents are bad. Incumbents can be wonderful, and we have rules and processes to encourage them. But we have to recognize there's so much talent that we're not currently tapping into. And if we can drastically accelerate the pace of progress.
Understood. So it's in some ways it's helpful for those of us who focus primarily on the Department of Defense and the intelligence community to understand that these are not particular problems just for the DoD and the IC. All of government has challenges with these. I suppose that's positive and depressing at the same time. Regardless, Bill, you think about this problem and have thought about it for many years, focusing on the Department of Defense, and you've done some, I think, groundbreaking work in the 2016 NDAA and more work which has just gone up online this afternoon. Love to hear your take on the problem space as you see it.
Sure, and everything what we're trying to address in the 16 NDAA and the 17 NDAA really comes from a difference in how we're approaching acquisition reform and the need for acquisition reform than we did 20 years ago in FASA and with the Section 800 paddle. We're looking at a change in and all of this is to us as being threat driven. And acquisition reform is an extremely important need to address a national security problem. And so what is that national security problem? Essentially, it starts from the fact that we no longer drive innovation. We are no longer the driver of research and development first of all, in the United States, and then secondly, in the globe. And so, beginning in 1980, the private sector surpassed U.S. government R&D. And that was important, and all of that drove acquisition reform in the late 80s and 90s. But the rationale behind acquisition reform, since the wall was coming down, was business management reform, getting more efficient. Our budgets were coming down, we need to become more efficient. Well, in the intervening 20 years, that commercial technology, that private technology, has been moving out globally. And so now no longer is the DoD losing out to the private sector, it's losing out to the global marketplace. And all of that is hugely important, particularly when the kinds of technologies that the department is looking at, whether it's the third offset or whatever it's going to be called in the new administration, there's still a need for robotics. There's still a need for data analytics, autonomy, all of these new things which are being driven. There's lots of DoD R&D there, but a lot of it is being driven out in the commercial marketplace. And so how do we access that, and how do we encourage those type of companies to come partner with us? The problem is, so we have a system, even though we reformed it 20 years ago to try to access commercial items, it's not as robust or it's not as agile as we would like it. Let's put it that way. And so the system can access the commercial innovation the way we wanted it to 20 years ago. It's risk averse, it's compliance oriented, and it really was optimized, in a DoD perspective, to win the Cold War. And it was optimized to win the Cold War against an adversary who thought in 5-year plans, who had the technology cycle time that we were dealing with was much slower. That world is gone. That world is changing, and so we need to become more agile and thinking in a different manner. But unfortunately, we replicated some of that Soviet-style thoughts and views in our acquisition system. And so the issue becomes how do we throw off those shackles and still have a system that meets the oversight and compliance needs that we're going to have when we spend taxpayer dollars. So I believe that's the problem.
That's perfect, and I do appreciate the communism reference. When I arrived in the United States about 11 years ago, I was setting up a small strategy company, and I had these visions of I'm moving to the United States, the land of the free market. I'm going to be competing. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be challenging. And then I ran into this sort of neo-communist buzzsaw. I was like, wait a minute, you're going to tell me what my profit is? This is un-American. I've been in the country about 3 months, and I was telling people what American was and wasn't. So I'm glad that 11 years later, we're on the same page.
We are definitely on the same page.
Lauren, I'd love to get your take, either from a DIUX perspective and also from a DoD perspective, of what's that core problem?
Sure. So I'll piggyback on a lot of what Bill said because I think we're very acutely feeling that problem, right? From the DIUX perspective, our mission is to accelerate innovation to the warfighter by reaching out to all of these, I'll call them non-traditional clusters of innovation that exist across the U.S. but don't traditionally work with DoD. And again, as Bill mentioned, right, over the past few decades, the trend has shifted to where private investment has now overtaken federal R&D. And what this means for us is that all of today's technology of consequences, all of the robotics, things that you mentioned, are rarely sponsored by the government, but all of these private investments are paying significant dividends in areas that are very important to DoD, right? So virtual reality, autonomy, cyber, all of these sorts of things. But at the same time, those high barriers to entry to working with DoD and the very long timelines in our acquisition system make DoD and DIUX sometimes an unattractive customer for these non-traditional innovators, right? Mm-hmm. And rather than competing for DoD work or deciding to work with us, they instead steer their business elsewhere to commercial customers or commercial investors, right, where they can work much more quickly and get a higher return on investment, right? So what this means for us and for DoD is that we have to be able to change our business practices in order to access these phenomenal technologies. And this is a really important cultural shift for us, I think, because we're used to working with companies, again, as Bill said, that have DoD as their primary, if not their only client, right? So the problem that we face is not only a business one, where we need to be able to streamline our processes and lower the barriers to entry, but also a cultural one, where we have to be able to transform ourselves from a monopsony into an attractive customer for these clients. And this is the problem that DIUX is working on solving.
Yeah, I think it's great. I had the opportunity to do a podcast with Raj Shah a couple of months ago, and for me, the really clarifying point that he made, in addition to all of that, is like, think about the amount of capital that is applied, non-taxpayer capital, to R&D in the private sector. Why is the Department of Defense not finding ways to leverage that?
Absolutely.
I think that's a perfect articulation of the whole thing. So I think that's a great articulation of the problem from a number of different perspectives. What is it you guys are doing about it? We've done a lot of work, a lot of good work. Matthew, I'd love to hear sort of the White House take.
Sure. And actually, as I was thinking about this, I think my comments probably might be most appropriate, actually, if I came last on the answer to this question, but
we can move things around.
Okay.
We are agile. Watch us do it live.
That's right.
The reason I say in advance is because I think what we want to do, especially in the civilian space, is mimic the good work that DoD is doing through DIUX and the lab environment that has some very specific goals to help create a more attractive marketplace for contractors.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. There's a lot of good being done. We don't want to miss that or just look for new things. Labs have been innovative for a long time. So, Bill, then clearly you've been doing a lot of work. I believe that the language for the 2017 NDAA is live online now.
It is online. It's on the House Rules Committee.
Yep. And if you for people online, I think we're going to tweet a link out to that right now as well. So, Bill, both for the 16 and 17 NDA, I'd love to get a summary of what you've been doing.
Sure. And again, I think it's put in the context of the problem of trying to reach out and address innovative non-traditional companies. Whenever the Department of Defense needs to become innovative, whenever the government needs to become innovative, what do they normally do? Whether it's World War II, whether it's the first offset, whether it's the second offset, and now whether we're in this, it traditionally goes around the system. And so essentially what we have done in the 16 and 17 NDA is give the Department of Defense tools and alternative paths to go around the existing system. Now, Does everything need to be going around the existing system? I think the system would crash. But the issue is for those things that are truly needed and we need to move around. We've given those tools, and it's going to take a while for the department to train up and get the expertise to do this again. So what are those tools? The first one is commercial item procurement, FAR Part 12. The one thing that's happened over the last 20 years in FAR Part 12 procurement is that numerous contracting clauses have accreted onto the system, making FAR Part 12 not much better than FAR Part 15 from a non-traditional standpoint. So we're trying to streamline that and get a hold of and reform commercial item procurement and focus back on the preference for commercial items in a lot of areas. That'll help in many areas, not just the ways of the new innovation, the new third offset that we probably need to go around the system on. The second area is the one that essentially is the alternative path, and that's other transactions. And other transactions has a long history from experimental authorities that were given back in the 1920s and into the World War II, and then finally in '58 we had those type of authorities given to NASA and eventually taken to DoD. We have expanded that authority to allow the department to actually not only research but prototype and then essentially buy in a different manner than the traditional FAR Part 12 and FAR Part 15 strategy. In addition to that, we're doing a lot of work in trying to streamline the existing system. We obviously want, and I think the next phase of this is to try to harmonize the existing system and make it more commercial-like. So we've opened up the aperture to commercial companies through FAR Part 12 contracting, other transactions contracting. Actually, we've improved experimental authority, which is a long-standing authority. And then we're working for the harmonization. How do we address the major barriers? And that's CAS, that's TINA, that's all of the oversight processes that we put on the traditional contracting system. How can we streamline that, make that, and incentivize the traditional contracting base to become more non-traditional? That I'll go to you.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that frustrated me personally coming out of the 2016 NDA was you provided the department all of these authorities, and then no one did anything with them, surprise, surprise, until the DIUX came along and actually did some of that. So Lauren, we'd love to hear what you've been doing with these shiny new authorities that Bill has given you.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we're incredibly thankful for them because, like you said, it has given us that kind of go-around path to be able to quickly reach out to these companies. It's so critical to our mission. As I mentioned before, I think at the heart of this is a cultural problem, and to solve a cultural problem, you need two things. You need some sort of initial action or demonstration that you can solve the problem, and then momentum to kind of build on that initial success. So first, action. So for DIUX, we had to be able to demonstrate to these companies that we could actually work at the speed of business and be an attractive customer to them. And so to that end, leveraging these great OT authorities, we developed a first of its kind acquisition mechanism called the Commercial Solutions Opening, or the CSO. And the CSO leverages these OT authorities, which essentially allow you to go around all of the normal rules and regulations of the Federal Acquisition Regulation and all of the statutes that apply to procurement contracts. And these flexibilities allowed us to design the CSO process that was fast, flexible, and collaborative. Fast, first of all, because it allows us to work with a company from initial company submission to award of the OT in less than 60 days. And that's lightning speed for the Department of Defense. Flexible because all the terms and conditions of the agreement are negotiable. So things like intellectual property or payment milestones, all of these factors that are traditionally very, I think, sensitive or maybe disincentivize some of these companies from working with us, we can actually sit across from them at the table and negotiate terms and conditions that work for both parties. And finally, collaborative. Under a normal, I would say, traditional defense acquisition, the government will develop a very specific requirement, prescribe a specific solution, toss it over the fence, have contractors and companies put together very detailed proposals behind a firewall without talking to us, and then give those proposals to us. What we've done at DIUX is to actually burn down that firewall. So instead of keeping all of these, the company and the government separate, we actually take the people who understand the technology and those potential solutions, those companies, those technologists, and put them in the same room with the people who really understand the root of the problem, or those warfighters. And together they can design a prototype project that meets the needs of both of those parties completely. So not only do we get a better outcome and a better project, but also saves a lot of time and money because collaboration and communication makes everything go faster, right? So we've been able to demonstrate through the CSO over the past 6 months or so that DoD can indeed move at the speed of business and be an attractive customer to these companies. However, it's not enough that DIUX ourselves is successful. And for us to kind of drive real cultural change, we need momentum. And that's what we're working on now. So as of today, this should be live on our website either right now or shortly later today at diux.mil. We've put together a DIUX CSO how-to guide, which I have fresh off the printer copy of here, in collaboration with our fantastic partners at the Army Contracting Command, at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and the Office of the General Counsel, to pull that together to share our experience with using these authorities to date, with deploying them and actually working with companies on this basis, so that others can hopefully build on our success with the CSO and broaden the industrial base for the department writ large, and really work to accelerate the acquisition process, right? So it's out there on our website now. We encourage any DoD organization, go to the website, download a copy, look at how you can use OT authorities, and you can leverage our success to build your own CSO to meet your own mission. And we're hoping that by spreading this across the department that we can really drive acquisition innovation across DoD.
It's fantastic. It's almost scary how much sense it makes, which it makes me a little bit pessimistic about success. It's like it's too sensible of an idea for the Department of Defense. But no, I'll remain optimistic anyway.
Perfect.
Matthew, I'd love to get your take here as well.
And actually, the reason why I wanted to go last on this is because OMB does a very good job at times at taking credit for other people's excellent work. But what we're really trying to do is emulate the goodness that you just described. And we see actually 4 areas to focus on to push innovation. One is senior management support, second, information sharing, third, talent development, and fourth is improving access to new entrants, which I think you guys you're capturing all of it. And first and foremost, with senior management support, absolutely, the cultural challenge is job one. And not suggesting that for every civilian agency that they need a DIUX. I mean, one of the things we learned right away was that agencies have very different missions, and therefore they need to create their own brand of what a lab looks like that works for their mission. But that said, I think the lesson to be learned is the fact that if you had the secretary saying when creating DIUX that there is departmental commitment and resources to make this happen, and that sort of backing, that sort of encouragement is going to be critically important to a workforce that oftentimes can be confused about, are these authorities for real and do they really want us to take advantage of them? So we asked agencies all to identify acquisition innovation advocates and encourage them to develop appropriate mechanisms. We like the idea of labs simply because of the great history that labs have had in the government as being test beds, but it again is up to the individual agency. Some have just a handful of folks and are still doing great things. But it's having a clear pathway and making sure that people understand that OMB is fully supportive of this. Secondly, with respect to information sharing, I think it goes without saying that we don't want people to feel like they need to recreate the wheel. I mean, the truth of the matter is that even when we have problems that we're facing, there's never a day when the government is at complete ground zero. There's always goodness happening, and we just need to do more to give visibility to the successes that we're having. And I think that, in some ways, we see as our greatest initial challenge in the innovation space is to get an innovation hallway up, to get snapshots of success and let people select and connect with each other, because there's so many people across the agencies that are trying to solve the exact same problem. We don't need everybody to have to recreate that. And in fact, our acquisition workforce, going back to the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, had talked about the lack of collaboration as being one of the largest barriers. Now, they probably meant that more than just information sharing and also how to bring the IPT together, but clearly there's probably no greater ask that we hear from the community in terms of how OMB can help than saying do whatever you can to make sure that there's information sharing. talent development. We're about to graduate the second class of our digital acquisition professional training program that for the first time is really in a large way focusing on or recognizing the need to have experiential hands-on training. You know, when you're doing simple tasks, you might be able to learn that from a manual and templates, but you can't really, you know, learn how to do complex IT.
Right.
Just simply from a textbook. I remember in the 1990s, I mean, we had great policies on performance-based acquisition, but in many instances, you know, people learned how to buy janitorial services well, but, you know, we continued to struggle because we didn't partner with each other and find people that were having success with complex IT. And this model, I think, is critically important. And last, the improving access for new entrants. And I think there, it's trying to find the tools that can help the workforce reach the community. Yes, Congress has been good in giving the Department of Defense, OT Authority, other agencies have this, but not everybody does. And they still have the need to be able to reach the community. And so we need to think about what are the various avenues that can be provided so that they can find talented companies. So for example, in software development, I'm looking at our good friend, or my good friend, Jonathan Muskowski, who is working with the department and the digital office, and issued an RFI recently to find out how we can create an agile marketplace. Who are the consortia out there that might be able to help us screen contractors in the same way that they would prove their capabilities to a commercial customer so that they can be qualified and then federal agencies can find them easily and do business with them. And by the way, that means open market transactions, which is not inconsistent with our need to reduce contract duplication. Because even when we consolidate, there's a lot of work that's going to go on that still requires open market, and it should be a goal. I think we need to actually acknowledge that more explicitly. There's always a benefit to growing the supplier base and making sure that we have an ample, a number of contractors that can help us in meeting our needs. So we are continuing to work with agencies, working with USDS, working with the Technology Transformation Service, working with the Department of Defense and others on what are the various pathways from pre-qualification to taking greater advantage of the commercial or the simplified procedures available for commercial items when it makes sense, to maybe leveraging the 8A business development program, because there are lots of contractors there actually that can do Agile, and we need to make sure that gets highlighted and find ways to tap into that.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. So, despite the fact that for someone like me who worries about this all the time, I do tend to get depressed that we're not making progress, but these sort of conversations do give me hope. I could ask many questions of all of you, but we have all of these other people who probably have better questions than I do. So let's open this up to a little bit of discussion and questions. We've got probably 15 or 20 minutes for questions. If you just raise your hand, I'll take them in order if I can, and then I'll repeat the question back. So.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. My first question is for Bill. Is there a sense on the Hill, or at least among SASC members and staffers, about the efficacy of DIUX, what successes or failures it's had so far, and also the necessity of it? I mean, you noted that these other transaction authorities are open not just to DIUX, but to DoD, writ large, or at least to a large extent. So, going forward, how important is DIUX? And then for Lauren, you mentioned that CSO, that's kind of been kicked into high gear, things are happening there. Is there kind of a next step that you're looking towards to further, bring people in and open this up?
And so I'll just repeat for the live stream. I think the question was for you, Bill. Do you believe, sitting next to someone from DIUX, that DIUX should continue?
No pressure.
What is the view from the Hill on that?
Sure.
And then Lauren, I'll hold your question after that.
Well, I mean, from view from the SASC is yes. Now, there are other there are other viewpoints in the Congress as well. I think there's still a learning on what DIUX is supposed to do, and there was DIUX 1.0 and now there's DIUX 2.0, and I think there's still a lot of misinformation out there. The way we look at it is someone needs to be to start driving some of these acquisition reforms. And if it's not DIUX, it has to be someone else. And I don't see anybody else on the horizon at the moment. Okay, I mean, the other transaction authority has been allowed to just atrophy away. There are only a few contracting officers in the entire Department of Defense that still even know that it exists and how to use it. And even then, they may not quite have their complete knowledge on how to exercise it. So as an experimental unit, as a way of going forward, and the other thing is that someone in the Department of Defense needs to understand how these commercial companies think. You know, the traditional acquisition workforce says, well, what's wrong with cost and pricing data? What's wrong with the cost accounting standard? What's wrong with having unique oversight and having 15 different auditors come to you every day? You know, that's just the way the process works. Well, that's not the way that Google and Facebook and Apple and whoever else we want to talk to in Route 128 or Austin thinks. And if they've got the technology, we have to start changing the way we think and how to address that. And that's what DIUX is trying to do. And that's why, you know, from a Senate perspective, why we think they're doing a great job. But they're still in the infancy, you know, so we can't, you know.
And Lauren, I hope you feel good right now.
Much better.
I would. The question I believe for you was sort of what comes after the CSO.
Sure. So I want to highlight one thing that actually goes back to the FY16 NDA and an authority that Congress gave us. So right now, through the CSO, we're doing prototype projects using these OTs, right? So kind of going around the system to do prototypes. And that's all well and good, but what happens after the prototype, right? Does that mean you have to go back into the FAR-based system? Does that mean you have to go back into a long competition? Because a lot of these companies won't be interested in that, right? So it kind of fails if that's all that we can do. But again, in the FY16 NDA and now in statute, Congress gave us the authority to do these follow-on production contracts or transactions, which is really exciting because it means that we can continue to use these OTs from cradle to grave and take these non-traditionals in an agile and responsive process all the way through experimentation and prototyping, all the way to doing transactions. And so DIUX is really excited to kind of take that next step once our awarded OTs get to that point for the ones that are successful and move forward into those production OTs.
And that's one of the reasons why we are encouraged by what they're doing, because no one else in the Department of Defense figured that out, okay? And we didn't go out and tell you. They essentially said, we have these authorities, and yes, you know, then there's a reason why Congress did that, because, you know, why stop at prototyping, and then you can't access these companies anymore? Well, you know, why would any company want to go do a big prototype and be done? And so at some point, you have to actually buy something.
Yeah, exactly right. I couldn't agree more.
Please,
Matthew.
One point on that, and again, I have great respect for, you know, the other transactions authority, but to a point that you made at the beginning, it isn't necessarily a panacea, and I have heard folks that talk about, and I don't want to attribute it improperly to Darvin, but I thought I heard them say that like the majority of the acquisitions they conduct, they actually do a lot that's FAR-based, but the point is they know how to do the other transaction and they know when to use it. And it can be difficult if you don't, right? Because dealing with a blank slate and having to negotiate IP rights, for example, can be pretty daunting, which is not a reason why it shouldn't be used. But I just wanted to put in a plug for, I know the department head, and I don't know actually, I don't know if you can tell me whether it's in the NDAA, but pilot authority that was basically broadening, if you will, the authority on broad agency announcements for the R&D.
And that survived.
Yeah. So I mean, and that is an example, for example, of a way in which other components within the department, and actually, I don't know if it was also granted to, I think the administration asked for a couple other agencies that already are doing BAAs that will now be able to hopefully get many of the same benefits, and also get the benefits of the FAR as well.
Excellent. Alana, I believe you have a question in the back.
Hey.
Alana Bertman, I used to be at DOD, and I wish when I was at AT&L, DIUX had existed, so thank you. The question I have is kind of a compliment to the last one, which is you guys didn't get a big budget. And so what do you find works best? What is still needed, which maybe you know, could take to the next year? In terms of having the funding and getting kind of the ultimate customers that, you know, within DOD to be interested in partnering with you to then make your authorities useful, and what's the best way to open the door for that?
So I think the question, Alana, is you made the point that the DIUX's budget is relatively humble, and the question is, what would it need to be, and then how do you work with that to encourage others to collaborate? Is that correct?
Right. DIUX partner within a greater.
Yeah. Well,
Well, you
Both of
want to go?
You can go first,
Okay,
and
all
I'll
right.
follow on.
I think from the budgetary standpoint, first of all, as we're now finding out, the budget's not finished. No matter what you see, there's going to be a CR, and therefore there's going to be something else. So as far as what the end budget's going to be for anybody, it's still a work in progress. I think that what DIUX can first do is serve as the laboratory for how to reach out and get through some of and have a template on how you address these non-traditional companies. What does that take? I don't know, but probably not a huge amount of money. And then the next thing is to broker and bring in with the folks who have real money, lots of money, and get them to use these authorities and so on. So I think there's this whole thing in Washington about, if you don't have a gazillion dollars, you're somehow not relevant. I don't think that's the case. This is a case of how we can radically change the culture in DoD and what change agents you have, and this is one change agent we have, and we're hoping it's successful.
And from DIUX's perspective, having this kind of co-investment with our DoD partners is an absolutely critical part of our model. For the 12 OTs that we awarded in FY16, they totaled about $36 million. Of that $36 million, only $8 million of that was DIUX funding. So what that means for every dollar that we put in from our admittedly small budget, we got another $3 of what I'll call traditional defense money coming in, right? And that's really important because it means that we're bringing in kind of this the larger DoD infrastructure into doing these projects and these deals with us, which is not only important to get these prototypes and initial projects going, but also for that follow-on transition back into back into DoD. And so they're critical partners for us.
Exactly. Matthew, do you have something?
And just broadening that to beyond on defense, if there's one thing that I've learned very clearly from the work that USDS and TTF have done and on the digital side is that if we're smart in using Agile or other types of authorities that do work incrementally, we get not only the benefit of having a higher likelihood of success, but risk management. But it doesn't necessarily take all that much money. I mean, exactly what you were saying, I think, applies 100% to the work that we're doing on the IT side. To the extreme of where we did it, or I should say, GSA did an experiment where they were able to, using the micro purchase authority, run a little competition and found people to help in developing some simple code.
That's right. I think one of the other things that we see, and this is where I've been helping promote all of your work, I'll promote some of our upcoming work as well. We have a report coming out December 14 called Future Foundry, and one of the things we look at there is the fact that the Department of Defense often underestimates the value it has to commercial companies.
Absolutely.
And so the reason that commercial companies want to work with Department of Defense, if we remove some of those barriers, is not for the $1 million contract or whatever it is. It's for access to DoD hard problems, to our testing facilities, to military personnel who can really explain why something will work or won't work. And so I completely agree. It's not purely about dollars. At the same time, we need to make sure you've got enough money to travel and visit people and actually incentivize people to do some work. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So here, and then I'll come around.
I'm Chris Ram, OFPP, and I've had the pleasure of this discussion with Lauren, but Bill, I'd like to get your take on it. I come from the DoD labs originally, and how is Congress feeling about having almost a competition internally? Because now you've got DIUX that's out trying to do all this innovative stuff. You've got a lot of DoD labs out there trying to do a bunch of innovative stuff too. So how is that sitting in Congress? I'd like to know that.
So sorry, Bill. Just the question is, what's the view from Congress in terms of potential competition between the labs and DIUX and other organizations seeking to innovate?
I mean, we have DoD invests in R&D. Now, obviously, invests in R&D in its internal labs. It invests in R&D with traditional defense contractors. Right here, we're trying to say, how can we leverage non-traditional R&D that's out there in the commercial marketplace? Three separate types of things. And as we're seeing, the department's R&D is now, it's just a fraction now of what's out there in that other world. So yes, the Congress values the traditional labs. Values the traditional contractors, but it also is looking for how do we, take advantage of this technology and knowledge out there, which if we don't do so, our adversaries just might.
right.
Okay? Now, maybe we can protect what we have here, but there's this whole world out there, and so I don't see it's not a zero-sum game.
Exactly.
And perhaps as we go down this transition, the traditionals and the non-traditionals and the labs can start working together, and perhaps reform will actually be positive for them as well. So it's like I say, I don't think Congress is right now seeing that as a zero-sum game.
Right.
Although maybe some labs and some traditional contractors may be thinking of that,
Yeah.
but that's not how it's looking.
It's not like we're suffering from a lack of hard problems for the
we
Department of
have
Defense.
a
We
lot
can-
of hard
yeah.
problems to solve,
Yeah.
and so come on, all comers, take care of our problems. We need it.
That's right. Now, I think Steve Nordland is here, and you had a question from Boeing. We'd love to take
thanks,
it.
Ben. Steve Norland, Boeing. And first of all, I want to commend the model and the outreach to non-traditional companies. I think you're absolutely right on the statistics and the value that you can get. My question is around eligibility, because clearly you're focused on the non-traditional. A company like mine is not probably considered non-traditional.
Well, half of your company might be.
I'm glad you see it. But if we were to take a position in a company that remains independent but has a change of ownership, and whether we have a majority interest in it or take over full ownership of a company, but it remains independent, do they still remain eligible for activity in DIUX?
So, sorry, Len. So the question from Boeing is essentially, if you were to invest in a startup, in a smaller, innovative company,
Or take ownership.
or have it as a wholly owned subsidiary, and Steve and I have talked about this in our startups podcast, would they still be eligible to work with the DIUX?
So any company is eligible for working with DIUX, even Boeing directly, right? The great thing about OTs is that they are so flexible. Obviously, they're geared towards non-traditional companies and small businesses, but traditional companies can work with us as well if we do a 1/3 cost share, or if the traditional is partnered with a non-traditional. And that's really important, right? Because I think that also incentivizes that collaboration between our very strong and very powerful and very important traditional defense industrial base with all of these smaller non-traditionals as well. And so I think OTs are fantastic in that they can kind of encourage that collaboration and still have them be eligible for these awards.
That's great. Bill,
I
Matthew,
think there is and perhaps OFPP could actually help us in defining this, because the non-traditional definition in statute talks about entities. And entities could be subsidiaries or various other units, business units within a company. There's been some interpretation of DoD that may or may not be the case. And so Congress may have to clarify what an entity is under a non-traditional definition, which then triggers the other transaction. I hate to say it's kind of a convoluted, there may be an interpretation by the department that says, defines an entity the way we would think in a more broad basis. So it's going to be really up to the regulators on that, I think, at the end of the day, or Congress is going to have to kind of really make the determination of what happens when a traditional company buys a non-traditional company, and is that non-traditional subsidiary still non-traditional?
Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard question, and I agree with my much more learned and smarter colleagues that this is something that we do need to look at. Just in actually addressing a simpler point, but a broader point that I think from a principle standpoint, and as we were thinking about this in the context of pre-qualification, we talked about getting new entrants in, and I think I said this earlier, that sometimes people hear what they hear is that's anti-incumbent, that we want to favor the Silicon Valley, for example, over the companies that we're doing business with. Absolutely not. But we do need to recognize that, and this is why the training is also important too, because like, for example, in agile software development, shame on us if we don't train our people to know how to use a new process. Right. We shouldn't be surprised when the companies that we do business with all the time continue to do business with us in the same way. But if we do make the investment and we create like a pre-qualification process, in my mind, I want incumbents that aren't doing it to be able to go through that and be able to participate. I mean, in other words, I think it's a success when the companies that are already in our system are also transforming with us and getting better, as simultaneously to bringing people into the marketplace. That doesn't answer your hard question, but again, from a principle, I just think it's important to remember that this whole conversation is not about let's just go find people that aren't doing business with the government for the sake of it.
That's right, and I think, and this is one of the things we argue in our upcoming paper, that the Department of Defense actually operates in multiple market segments and has very different needs. And so the providers and the technology component providers and the process should be different for aircraft carriers compared to nuclear weapons, compared to open source software solutions compared to robotics. And that sounds obvious when we say it on a panel like this, but when you look at the system, it doesn't actually have that nuance built into it. And we shouldn't let that flow into our industrial base. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Christopher Zemba with the quick hand there.
Good. So on the topic of training, so Christopher Zember with Alliance Science and Technology, now recently departed the acquisition world in DoD. Training and culture. So are you focused on, maybe for everybody, are you focused on reacculturating the entire system to be more friendly, or creating separate pockets that can be focused on these more innovative methods? And let me say, I would like to believe that the entire system can change, but having worked with R&D contracting shops that hired people out of facilities contracts, and those people really struggled to adopt that culture that was prevalent around them, that makes me question it. And then Rick Dunn, who was the associate counsel for DARPA, or for NASA, that brought OTs over to DARPA, suggested that DoD should focus on developing a different core outside of the traditional acquisition core for other transactions. So kind of his view causes me to question. So I'm just curious about your perspective.
So I think we've got,
and Lauren.
so we've got a theory of change question, essentially, is as we're seeking to change the culture, should we seek to change the entire organization, or go after specific smaller organizations within there? Perhaps an ink spot theory of change. I don't know if we want to get into counterinsurgency too much with the acquisition workforce, but Bill, you'll bring that to the
I think the practicality of it is yes, we have to create a cadre of expertise along different lines. So, for example, what DPAP and DCMA are trying to do in pricing is one area. Perhaps we need a market research unit that understands what's out there in the commercial marketplace and can feed into it. Perhaps we need another transactions cadre that can do that. So that's the beginning. But I do think also we need, one of the biggest problems we have is that everyone is stovepiped, and our whole education training system is stovepiped. So I'm a logistician, I do this. I'm a contracting person, I do this. I'm a program manager, I do this. I'm an engineer, and I do this. And I get level 3 certified, but I don't talk to these other folks until I get into a program office, and maybe I don't even talk to them when I'm there. So maybe the next level of training is to bring these integrated cross-functional training exercises. DIU might be the place to do that. And then, because I still think there is hope, because the whole culture is eventually going to have to change. But in the meantime, I think we're going to have to solve the expertise problem and do that incrementally.
Lauren, you had something as well?
Yeah, so from the way I think about this problem is I call it the boiling frog analogy, right? So if you try and put a frog in a pot of boiling water, he's just going to jump right back out, right? But if you put him in a pot of cold water and then slowly turn the heat up, that's when he'll eventually boil.
Is that what you're doing at the DIUX? Your frogs there and it's just...
No, but I actually have, I'm hoping that we're turning up the heat a little bit, but I think that incremental aspect of change is really important, because I've worked with incredible folks in the defense acquisition workforce. I'm a member of the defense acquisition workforce, and I think that they have enormous dedication, very hardworking, and are trying to do the right thing, and really succeeding in the face of all odds, in the face of all of this. So the more tools that we can give them to do their jobs properly, I think the better. And if this is an additional tool that they can add, if we can train them to do the right thing, to do this properly, to do OTs properly, and empower them to take risks, I think we're starting to collectively turn up the heat on ourselves.
I think Matthew's point on best practice identification, in other words, when someone does something right, we should, broadcast it. When someone uses an authority in the right way, let's broadcast it. If there are lessons, right now what we do is we learn, there's something bad happens, that's our lessons learned, and don't ever do that again, and we better write a law to stop that. Okay, and so the idea is we need a different method of training, a different method of oversight, and I think that's, if DOD and OMB and such can start broadcasting that would be really helpful, I think.
Absolutely. Matthew.
And so I was going to use a related analogy with boiling. I don't think it's anything, but just boiling the ocean, right? And so I guess when we've looked at this, and we thought about this when we put out our memo, because sometimes agencies get a little weary if they think that OMB is putting something out, and the first thing they think is, oh my God, what do we have to do now? And this, if you go back and look at this memo from March of 2016 that asked agencies to identify innovation advocates, you'll see it's remarkably flexible, I believe. It's not prescriptive in telling people the solution because, as we talked about earlier, it really has to be branded by each agency, and each agency has to find its way. Now, as we go along, we may want to become a little bit more concrete on some of this, but I think to put it another way, and you could probably say this about any profession, or certainly any within the IPT of acquisition, whether it's a contracting officer, your lawyers, IT folks, program people, and that is there's some people that are ready to and want to jump in and be innovative and take big risks. And it's probably the smallest percentage, but it's a relatively small percentage. Then you have another group of people that are kind of the wait and see, right? They want to see somebody jump in first, and then they're going to be right there. And then they're probably going to be some people that just they don't really want to participate all that much in that. And I think if we try to manage this process by trying to get the people that are kind of the most reluctant to participate, we'll waste all of our time on that, and we will ignore the needs of those that are willing and ready and able. And the truth of the matter is, I think there are plenty of people within our workforce
Absolutely.
that are in that first group, and certainly when you add in the second group. And by the way, this is no criticism of the people in the third group, because there's lots of stuff that has to happen every day, where we don't necessarily need cutting edge. We already have solved it, and we have a steady state, and we just need good, smart people that can use tools like we're doing with category management and creating, vehicles that people can use to buy the common goods and services. So I think that the answer is not to boil the ocean. I don't know if it's quite inkpots, but the incremental and focusing it on the kind of the coalition of the willing, and be really smart about it, give them cover. I think if we can do that, at least right now, we will make huge progress.
I agree, and that's a strong affirmative note on which I think we can end. So I'd just like you all to take a moment to thank our panelists for a fantastic conversation. Thank you guys. So if you could all just stay in your seats, we're going to do a quick move some chairs around, and then we're going to proceed to our lightning round practical case study conversation. So just 2 minutes while we get organized here.